What we're here tonight to talk about is healthcare coverage boot camp, and so what we are attempting to do by having these meetings is to bring the information that people need to make good decisions about their health coverage options in a way that is useful to them and helps them make good choices so they make the right decision for the long-term benefit of their family. And a lot of people would probably, and rightfully, start off saying, well, you know, why is it important? What's so important about health care? And so one of the sides of reasons why it's important is financially. If you did a survey and looked through the internet pretty thoroughly, you would find almost in every publication that most of the bankruptcies in the United States are tied to medical costs. So this one, for example, says 2/3 of people who file for bankruptcy cite medical issues as a key contributor to their financial downfall. Now, obviously, there's other things at play as well, but when a family is vulnerable financially and they have medical issues on top of that, that's more often than not the catalyst for things spiraling out of control where they're not able to recover from it. And then if you notice this last sentence here, this is something that we want to talk quite a bit about as we go through this material tonight. It says what most people do not realize, according to one research, is that their health insurance may not be enough to protect them. So even if you've got good health insurance, it can be extremely difficult to withstand the financial difficulties that are brought on by medical costs. So imagine if you didn't have good health insurance. So if you can't survive it with it, you certainly wouldn't survive it without it. So that's one of the key building blocks. This is a different article talking about what are the most common causes of bankruptcy. This one again says 66.5% of the bankruptcies in 2019 were related to medical costs. So both articles, and no matter how many you read, you're going to find almost every article about bankruptcies tying in very heavily to medical costs. And this one again points out that even with health insurance, high deductibles and co-pays plus job loss still impact Americans, and that's it as it relates to bankruptcy. So health insurance is critical, but in some cases, even good health insurance isn't quite enough. So we're gonna go beyond just health insurance in a lot of what we talk about. I think that it helps for us to have an accurate idea of what insurance is really designed for. This is, I'm not sure if it's Wikipedia or what it was at, but it gave two good definitions. One is a practice or arrangement where a company or a government agency provides a guarantee of compensation for specific losses, damages, illnesses, or death in return for a payment of premium. It's just a contract between individuals and someone else that says, I'm going to give you a small known amount of money each month, and you're going to cover a larger unknown risk out there in the future at some point. And so it's an agreement between those two. I like this second one because I think it really drives home something that people need to understand. This one says that insurance is a thing providing protection against a possible eventuality. Okay? So as we walk our way through this, we're going to come back to that, and we're going to talk about when something is really a risk that you need to employ the help of an insurance company to protect against, or when you ought to just keep that risk for yourself. So that's the next topic, is retained risk versus insured risk. We can't really change the risk that we're associated with. And you can change your job and maybe change the risks that affect your business by changing job. I mean, farmers face all kinds of risks from weather and everything else. Well, maybe if you were, building heat pens, weather risk no longer is a problem. But there are risks related to building heat pens that you would assume at that point. So you can't get away from risk. The best thing you can do is to manage them. And when you manage risk properly, you will probably keep some of the risk for yourself, and which would be a retained risk, and others are gonna shift to an insurance company and say, I can't afford to take that risk. And so then you enter into an agreement with that insurance company to assume that risk at some point. Okay, things to remember about these two. Retained risk is less expensive than insured risk is, generally speaking. Okay? I like to think of it like your cable bill. You know you're going to have your cable bill. You know it's going to come around once a month. Is there any way that it would be cheaper for you to pay someone to pay your cable bill for you? No, they're going to charge something for the service. So, retained risk is less expensive than insured risk, generally speaking, just means that an insured risk is always going to have some additional cost tied to it. Okay? It doesn't mean that asking an insurance company to take over that risk is a bad idea, but it's going to be more expensive than one that you would retain for yourself. The exact point where a risk should be shifted to an insurance company varies. It varies by individual, it varies by income, it varies by savings, it varies by your opinion about just how big that risk really is. So there's lots of things to take into consideration when to decide whether or not you want to shift risk to an insurance company. Insuring anticipated risk normally results in more than 100% cost. So if it's something you know is going to happen, like your cable bill, there's no way you can outsource that cheaper than just paying it yourself when it comes up. And we'll get to why that's an important thing to keep in mind in just a minute. Pooled risk by insurance companies often present both opportunities and obstacles. Okay, so you've got certain opportunities that you get to share the risk with other people, and therefore that might bring the cost of protecting against that risk down some. But then again, there may be issues in that pooling because you may be extremely unlikely to suffer from that risk, but you may be pooled with other people that are far more likely to encounter that risk, causing problems. So your cost then would go up. So, it's a give and take when you enter into agreements with insurance companies, because you don't know if you're getting the better end of the deal by asking them to assume the risk, or if you're getting the short end of the stick. But those are things that come into consideration as you work through that. Something that I think that when we talk about health insurance is you need to always keep primary catastrophic risk front and center. Okay? If it weren't for that heart transplant or that prolonged illness that requires repeated admissions into the hospital and surgery, if it was just a possibility of an occasion of maybe one time having a $50,000, $60,000 bill, a lot of people would forego insurance altogether and just save money and borrow the money if they have to pay off the hospital and then go on. But it's those large catastrophic events that always need to be dealt with first, and then deal with the other risks as they come along. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that again in the future in the next slide. Always make sure that when you're making adjustments to how you've insured your risk or retained your risk, always make adjustment to the proper risk. And that again is going back to, I see people all the time that get really frustrated because, in their words, they say, I pay all this money for my health insurance and then it doesn't cover anything. Okay? And in some manners of speaking, that may very well be true, but why are we covering the insurance in the first place? Is it to cover the ER visit? Not really, because if that's all we ever had to worry about, we wouldn't buy insurance. We're buying insurance to cover the catastrophic risk. And so don't go cancel your catastrophic risk because it's not paying for the ER room. Find some other way to deal with that ER expense. Don't cancel your catastrophic coverage. And so we'll again talk more about that. Maximum coverage of the primary risk at a minimum expense is the goal. So you're wanting to get all the coverage you can for those things you can't handle on your own for the least amount of money. Some people only have one choice. Some people have multiple choices. And so we'll talk about some of those choices that exist out there. And then it's also, as you're talking about how to properly retain or insure risks through an insurance company, you want to review what you're trying to accomplish and how it's going fairly regularly, because things change. And so you can't make one decision one time and just say, okay, I'm glad I got that out of the way. I won't ever have to deal with that again. You need to deal with it fairly regularly, because things do have a tendency to change. So let's talk now about the types of healthcare risks that are out there. This may not be every single alternative, but it's the majority of them will fall in one of these categories. You have the anticipated and regular risks that are out there. Immunization for children. Annual exams. The things that you anticipate, and they come around fairly regularly. It may not always be every year, but every 5 years or every 3 years or every so often. But those are things that you know are going to happen, and you know about when they're going to happen. And then there are those things that you expect to happen, but they're sporadic. A broken arm. You expect that. If you've got 3 kids, you're going to break an arm or two probably, before those kids are out on their own. It's going to happen, but you don't know when. So you anticipate it, you just don't know when that is actually going to happen. And then we get into the unanticipated. And so you get into the unanticipated, financially inconvenient or short-term things. Okay, so the ER room, because you fell off the bleachers at a ball game. Okay? ER visits can be expensive, especially if you have to set a bone or have stitches. All of us have our stories. And those are not expected. I mean, you might anticipate you might have an ER visit, but you're not sure you're going to have that. So it's unanticipated, and it can be financially inconvenient to have to pay that ER bill, especially if you have high deductibles on your medical insurance. And so it can be inconvenient, but it's usually short term, meaning within a year or two, even if you paid it out by the month at the hospital, you're able to kind of put that behind you and get on about life. So would we buy extremely expensive insurance to cover unanticipated inconveniences? No, we wouldn't pay the kind of money that we pay for health insurance for that. So we're not even into the reasons why we buy health insurance with these first three. The anticipated regular. Now, there are some anticipated regular expenses for people that have developed serious illnesses that would definitely be catastrophic in nature. I'm talking about kind of incidental things right now. So now we move to the fourth stage here: unanticipated, financially stressful, but they're still short term. Okay, now you don't have an ER visit; you have something more expensive. And you have something that definitely causes you, if you have insurance, to use up your out-of-pocket maximum for that year. And so this is still short-term, but it's not just inconvenient. You have to sacrifice to pay that out-of-pocket. Maybe you have to sell something. Maybe you have to cancel a vacation. It's more than an inconvenient. It now is becoming stressful. Okay. The next step up would be, again, unanticipated, but instead of stressful, now we have something that's burdensome. It could be a short-term situation with a long-term impact. If you were to have someone have, let's say you have a car accident, and you have reconstructive surgery, and you were off somewhere, and you either don't have insurance or you're out of your insurance's network, and so you had double the out-of-pocket maximum maybe you had an air flight helicopter ride that cost $28,000 and your insurance just paid $5,000. You know, so now you've got something that are burdensome. You're refinancing your house or pulling money out of the 401k at this point to help pay off the parts of that burdensome event that weren't covered for whatever reason on your insurance. Okay? Now you're getting into some things that really change lives around. And then the final is what we all hope never happens, but it happens all the time, or medical bankruptcies wouldn't be 66% of the reason why people file bankruptcy. Now you have this unanticipated, financially devastating event that has long-term issues and long-term impacts. So there is, I think, the situation that those articles are talking about when they say, even with good health insurance. If you have good health insurance and they pay all of the expenses this year for whatever that devastating illness was, but you have out-of-pockets and deductibles and co-pays, and you can't go back to work. And this happens in September, October, and then in January you start over again with out-of-pocket maximums, deductibles, co-insurances, and co-pays. And now you've had 2 years back-to-back with out-of-pocket maximums, and you haven't been able to return to work. And so I think that's when those articles are talking about, even with health insurance, you know, sometimes it's not enough to keep the financial home put together. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, as we look at these two areas primarily, things that have long-term impacts that are either burdensome or devastating, whether it's a short-term issue or a long-term issue. Do we have the right things in place to do the best job we can to manage the risk of running into one of these two things? Okay, does that make sense to say that is fairly important as you look out after the well-being, the financial well-being, and the physical well-being of your family? I mean, it's difficult to imagine having a child that develops leukemia and you can't take that child where you want to take that child and get treatment because you don't have health insurance, or you don't have, you don't have the money to pay for it, and you don't have health insurance. And so, these things, it's like most insurance. You don't really need it until you need it, and you don't really realize how important it is until you need it in a big way. And so our goal is to try to help people anticipate the unexpected and be frugal in how they prepare to be, properly protected if that unexpected long-term impact comes along. So these are the types of insurance that are offered that I would say are catastrophic in nature. They're designed to cover that huge hospital bill that one of the lady in our church put on Facebook the other day. What was the cochlear implant? $81,000 for a cochlear implant in a newborn. And so those kind of things, or the $10,000 a month drugs that come after having cancer treatment sometimes. All those kind of things that, they don't happen to everybody, but they happen to some people, and we don't know if they're going to happen to someone in our family. And so these things are generally what I would say catastrophic coverages, meaning that they have a maximum out-of-pocket limit for you and your family in a given calendar year. So you may not know how much you're going to have to spend next year. You don't know how long yet. It's devastating. You don't know the length of the impact yet, but it puts you in a position of knowing that in a given year of those expenses that are eligible, you know how much your out-of-pocket will be. So even if that bill hits $1 million this year, if your out-of-pocket is $6,700, when you hit $6,700, you're done. Okay? Now, obviously, you talk to anybody that's been into one of those type of cases, sometimes that means you go to MD Anderson, you go to the Mayo Clinic, you're off work, you have motel bills, you have travel bills, you're eating out while you're there. It's not paying the ancillary expenses, but in terms of taking care of you or your loved one, that catastrophic coverage does have a maximum that you'll have to pay every year. Okay, so most employer provided major medical, that would be state, federal, TRICARE, employer, if it's a state or a federal plan, it's likely in line with the Affordable Care Act, which did do a lot of negative things, I think, but it did some real positive things too. And it pretty well put those catastrophic expenses all in, even things that weren't covered under private health care before the Affordable Care Act forced those into the program. You know, some examples of that would be autism. You know, a lot of policies used to not pay anything for autism, and that can become very expensive. And under the ACA approved plans, autism, you know, was put under that. Now, with that came higher costs. You know, an ACA compliant plan is more expensive than a private health insurance plan that would be considered catastrophic. It just didn't have quite as many things that were eligible. So there was give and take on that. But most of the federal, state, that would be TRICARE, veterans, you know, when you get into those benefits, they do a pretty good job of covering catastrophic care, even home health care in a lot of cases, you know, for really devastating types of illnesses. And most employer plans are just as good as the state and federal plans. So there's a pretty common thread that runs through most employer-sponsored plans is that they are going to do a pretty good job of taking care of the high-end expenses. And you're going to be, you know, you're going to have a point at which you can stop spending your own money for healthcare expenses once you reach that cap. Individually purchased plans that fall under ACA are likewise going to be very good at catastrophic type illnesses. Okay? Now, we're going to talk about why some of the people that you might bump into or you hear talking or what you might see on television or read on Facebook talk about how I pay all this money and it don't cover anything. We'll talk about where that likely stems from and what is a better way to approach that issue than going back and trying to do something radically different on your catastrophic coverage in a minute. So the individually plans are good. Short-term medical plans are becoming very popular because when you're buying an individual plan, if you're not at the open enrollment period, which is like this year, November 7th through January 15th, that's the only time you can buy as an individual that you can buy an ACA compliant plan, unless you have another qualifying event. So when people just decide in the middle of the year that they better buy some health insurance and they can't buy an ACA compliant plan because it's not open enrollment and they haven't had a qualifying event, then they will opt to buy a short-term medical plan. Now, a short-term medical plan I have with conditions, that's not going to do you any good for something that you are already having an issue with. Okay? So if you've got a pre-existing condition, a short-term medical plan will not provide catastrophic coverage for that condition. But anything that develops after you buy the plan, it would do a good job. So if you're very healthy, haven't had any health issues, and you're without insurance and you're just wanting to buy something in case the unexpected happens, you have a car wreck or, you know, whatever, you catch COVID and you end up one of those cases that gets really serious and you're in the hospital. So if you just need coverage, you can buy that, but it does have conditions on when it is really a good alternative for catastrophic type expense. And then health sharing ministries. Most of them are Christian based. They have been around for 30 years now, 30 plus for some of them. There are good Christian Health Share Ministries, and there are poor Christian Health Share Ministries. If you research it a little bit, it's not hard probably to find the good ones. And of the good ones, they do a very good job on catastrophic coverages. Again, with conditions. The pre-existing condition issue will come up in Christian Health Share for the first 3 years in most of the plans. So if you had an existing condition that you've received treatment for in the past 12 to 24 months, that condition, should it recur after you go onto a health share plan, will probably not be covered for the first 3 years. Okay? So they're like a proceed with caution type of option, but when there is no pre-existing conditions and you meet the other parameters of those, they can be very good. We're going to actually have, a week from tonight, we're going to have another meeting that just talks about these and tries to answer the questions that people would have about that are considered. Because it is a viable option if you fit the parameters of where they work well. So, now there are other, these are some federal and state programs that are still catastrophic in nature, but they really don't have a clear-cut out-of-pocket maximum. In other words, they'll pay for a lot of the high-end expenses, but they're not quite as defined as something that's issued by an insurance company and written into a contract. It's an agreement between the federal government and the state, or in some cases, tribal authorities. A lot in Oklahoma, we have a fairly large Native American population, and most of those Native American tribal members have access to the Native American health services. And those are great preventative services and minor care type services, and they even at times will refer you out or have the ability to handle some of the more advanced. But there are things they can't do, and there are places where they can't help. And so it's great to have that available and to utilize it where it fits, but you are still at risk of running into one of those really catastrophic events that could just turn the world upside down and find that this really wasn't quite enough. The same with Medicaid and Sooner Care. They have a lot of great attributes, and they take really good care of a lot of things, but there are some places where they fall short of what you would have if you were on some type of ACA compliant plan. And so I would still put them in the catastrophic category, but with Medicaid and Sooner Care and Native American and health share ministries and short-term medical, there's a few conditions. There are places where catastrophic losses could still catch up with you. But if you stay with these ACA plans and state and federal plans that are, being offered to the employees or to the service members, generally speaking, you won't run into places where they just completely say, hey, we don't do that. Now, does that mean there are no services that they don't cover? Absolutely not. I mean, if you decide you're going to have cosmetic surgery just because you want to have cosmetic surgery, I don't think there's any of these that will pay a dime on it. So it doesn't mean they cover every potential medical service that you could ever have, but they all have what they call their eligible expenses, and they are fairly uniform, and they generally don't bail out on things that are life-sustaining or critical to regaining normalcy in your life. And so there's a whole chapter that could be written about, okay, well, at some point, do they get to their end of the rope and stop approving things? Obviously, there probably are, but those things are few in number, even though they're great in significance when they happen. They're few in number, and I don't think that you can make your decisions about what you want to do on health coverage based on the exceptions rather than the rules. But as a rule, catastrophic coverage would be very solid on either one of those, and pretty solid on the remaining things on this page. I did put this bottom down here, as I just cringe every time that I see things on social media and even on television, and what they're doing is they're aggressively marketing some products that have their place, but they are not catastrophic coverages. And so when people have become frustrated because my plan up here that I pay so much for don't pay anything, meaning I have to pay my deductible and my copay. I'm paying this big premium, and I've got a $5,000 deductible, and so I went into the ER room and it ran $2,000, and my insurance didn't pay anything. That's true, but that ER room isn't really what that is designed. That these plans are designed to cover first dollar. That's why the deductible is there, is to make it more affordable for you. So if something like an accident that results in an ER visit is a big thing, don't cancel this and buy a hospital plan that pays you $150 a day if you're in the hospital, and when the hospital bill may be $700 a day. Or even if it's going to pay $700 a day, but it doesn't pay for the surgery that was required. And so there's a lot of people aggressively marketing named benefit plans, which say if this happens, you get so many dollars, and trying to make those look like good substitutes for catastrophic coverage, which they are not. Now, a lot of people buy those so that they don't have to pay their hospital, their deductible if they go into the hospital, because I'm getting $750 a day or $1,500 a day for being in the hospital, so I'm going to use that to pay my deductible. I mean, I'm not going to argue with someone. I don't know that that's always a good idea, but that would be an okay use for these plans, but not to substitute for the catastrophic coverage. And that's what I see happening a lot in our industry. Okay, so now we get to we've kind of outlined all that. What is insurance? What is risk shifting or retaining risk look like? What are the types of risks that we're exposed to? What are the things out there that provide the most critical element, which is the catastrophic coverage? So now we're saying, okay, we've now got that catastrophic coverage kind of isolated. We know where we can get that if we're in a good spot to afford it. But what about all these other people that had good catastrophic coverage and still had to file bankruptcy? So what are some other things that we can do? How can I improve my catastrophic coverage that even goes beyond that? What are the things out there? What are the tools that different people use to stay out of that financially crippling situation, not only by having catastrophic coverage, but by also taking some other steps to make sure that we don't find ourselves there? So I think you have to divide it into two realms. If you are on an employer-sponsored plan, there's not much you individually have to do with what your employer is going to offer you. So you kind of have to work with what you've got there. So you're saying, okay, I'm on my employer-sponsored plan. A typical arrangement is that the employer will pay the employee's premium, but they don't pay any or don't pay very much on the dependents. Okay, so the first thing is let's focus on the next levels. Where are my dependents at on their catastrophic coverage? Do they have catastrophic coverage? If not, what's out there that I need to consider as possible alternatives to paying this pretty high price that my employer wants to put my dependents on their plan? Are there other options out there? And so that would be step one. Protecting your income. You have a distinct advantage by being an employee in that group benefits are usually a lot cheaper than buying individually. And so it could be that maybe your employer doesn't offer short-term disability or long-term disability. But if you think back to that, one of the reasons why people, even with good health insurance, still have to file bankruptcy is losing their job. So if you can continue your income while you're recovering from your illness or your injury, then that lowers your risk of having to file bankruptcy because, even though you had good insurance, you lost your job. So that would be something to look at. And then out-of-pocket expenses. What are ways to address the out-of-pocket expenses that are never going to get lower than they are right now? It's just something we have to manage. So have we got a good plan for managing out-of-pocket expenses? That happens to be the topic of the Tuesday meeting next week. Because that too, if we try to do all this in one meeting, can't hardly get anybody here for a 45-minute meeting. You sure can't get people here for a 3-hour meeting. And so that's why we kind of chop these up into pieces, and while we're making different different videos of each meeting, so that as people request information, we can send it out to them. So that would be a good place to start. And again, I mentioned it here, group benefits are generally less expensive. For example, I don't remember how old I was, but I was working at an employer and I looked at buying an individual long-term disability policy for myself. And the premium was $70-something a month. Well, I went to my employer, actually I went to our benefits person and had them put together a long-term disability policy for the company that the employee had to pay for. So it wasn't an employer's expense, but it was $19 a month for the exact same type of coverage. And so that's why I say, we can maybe leverage this if in areas where employers are willing to listen to something their employees want and talk to someone. Maybe we can make something beneficial happen there. And then there are ways of targeting the larger risks for shifting. So those things we're really worried about. We've got catastrophic, insurance costs. We're shifting that to the insurance company. We're shifting the possibility of losing our job to a disability insurance policy. But that still does not mean we don't have deductibles and copays. So if you could pay those deductibles and copays for less than the full value, that kind of makes sense, right? And there are some things that we'll talk about here Tuesday night that help us to save effectively for the smaller risks. The things that you can handle on your own, but you sure hate paying dollar for dollar every penny that it costs to do that. So shift the catastrophic expenses to a health insurance company. Shift the not being able to go back to work to a disability company. And wisely save to most efficiently and effectively pay for the smaller out-of-pocket costs that you still have to pay. If you can do those three things, I think you've gone a long ways to saying, I'm probably not going to end up as one of those 66% people. Okay, that works really great in the employee realm. Now, if you're self-employed or you're not working, some of that will work even if you're employed. If it's a small employer, they may not offer health insurance. You may be buying your own major medical catastrophic insurance. Well, some of these things we could still do there. But let's just say that you're buying your own plan and you're self-employed. Maybe you're the only person that works in the business. You don't have any employees. Well, the first thing that you need to do is maximize the cost effectiveness of your catastrophic coverage. There are subsidies that are available under the ACA plan based on income, and it's not gross income, it's adjusted gross income. So there are a lot of people that qualify for premium subsidies that don't realize that they qualify for that. Now, we could get into a long debate about whether that's good or bad for the country, but regardless of whether a person thinks it's good or bad, it's the world that people live in. And if you're going without catastrophic coverage and you could afford it with a subsidy that you're eligible for, even if you don't like that idea, that may be a better option to do something, be a conscientious objector to something that you're doing, and vote for people that want to change it and promote trying to change it if that's what it takes, but for goodness sake, don't lose everything you worked for just because you didn't want to apply for a subsidy that you're paying the taxes for everybody who is taking it. So, there's lots of room for interpretation, and it's a pretty subjective topic, but my job is to help people avoid catastrophic losses. And if there is a government program that you are eligible for, and that's the only way you can provide catastrophic coverage for you and your family, I think you're wise to at least find out exactly how it works, what it would cost, and then make your decision. And I, for one, think it's a bad idea for the country. I would vote for anybody who had a good plan to get rid of it, but if I needed it to take care of my children until that happens, I would probably participate and take the subsidy. And, I gripe all the time, but I would probably do it. So, that's number one on someone who's buying their own. And use the subsidies where appropriate, and then target, same thing. Then you go back right here. Once you get here, this message, I think, is universal in both worlds. Target the larger risks for shifting. So if you're an individual, you probably need to look at an individual disability policy if you can qualify for it medically and if you can afford the premium, because that's the only way to guarantee that if you have an illness or an injury that renders you incapable of working, that you're going to have continued income. And so that's something to at least consider. And then save effectively for those things that you know you're going to have to pay, your deductible, your co-insurance, and all of that. There are ways of getting that at about a 30 to 35% savings, and there's ways of getting that up to about a 65 to 70% savings. And which one you would use would depend on a lot of things, which is why we have to have another night to really talk about that. As far as the subsidies go, this is something not many people ever see this chart, they just hear it, and it was actually changed some last year. This is not for 2022. Everything about this they keep close to the vest until right before November 7th, but I'm going to guess there won't be much change in these. So let's just use a family of 4 as an example. So if you've got, this is the guidelines for being eligible for subsidies. So if you're in a family of 4, if your income is between $26,500 and $106,000 on an adjusted gross income, which is how much did I make and how much do I get to take off for all of my dependents, yada, 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 and you get to the adjusted gross income, then there are subsidies available in that range. Now, I can't tell you exactly what your subsidy would be because it depends on where you fall in that range. Because right here, you're not getting much subsidy. And right here, you are actually having to put your children on sooner care, and the subsidy only applies to the parents. And at this, since we have qualified, we've expanded Medicaid, I'm not even real sure how that's interpreted yet. This may be where the whole family has to go on. If you make under this, then everybody's on sooner care because we expanded Medicaid. And so I think that's actually how it will go. And this is premium subsidy only. And then if you fall between these two numbers, you probably are getting your health insurance for 0 cost. And in this, between 36 and 66, you're actually getting help for deductibles and copays. So it's possible that if you're a family of 4 and you happen to make exactly $36,750, you would get the ACA plan of your choice with a 0 deductible and no out-of-pocket. So that's what potentially is available to people who qualify for the subsidies. Again, am I a fan of that? Does that really sound like it makes a lot of sense? To be doing that, I'm not a big fan. But if I'm a father of two and I've got a wife and I'm making $36,570 and I'm making too much money to qualify for sooner care, and I'm not making enough money to afford a $2,000 a month premium, and I have to do it this way to protect my family, I'm probably going to do it until something better comes along. And so our goal is to let people know that this exists, that they might fall somewhere where this benefits them and allows them to do something for their family that they need to do, but right now can't afford to do. And if they are eligible for that, our job is to walk them through that and help them explain, help explain to them how much they do qualify for, which plan they would be best off with we would explain the plan. You decide which one's best, but our job is to explain and kind of navigate you through that next. Okay? So that would be, fall back to this person right here, making sure that they maximize the cost effectiveness of their catastrophic plan. Now I'm getting mixed messages from different sources, but I think it also could apply to dependents that are eligible for an employer plan, but that employer plan does not meet the definition of affordable. So, okay. So this is just kind of I guess an opportunity or an invitation to come back on the 5th, where we're going to talk about managing these out-of-pocket expenses. Get into a little more detail about what's out there, who's eligible for which ones. It's really more of a anticipated usage that would determine which of the options you would pick. And so we'll talk about that because there's no way out of those out-of-pocket expenses. I would say the only thing we can count on is they're going to keep going up along with everything else. There's government involved and non-government tools for savings. The net effect is saving from 30 to 66%, and there's really no cost to these tools, no cost to using them. Some out-of-pocket risks are catastrophic in nature. I mentioned it earlier, and hopefully we'll have a little more detail on some options for that as well by next Tuesday. But a helicopter ride out of your hospital's network, some of those helicopter emergency can get upwards of $50,000 to $60,000 for one trip. And if you're out of network, they're only going to pay a portion of that. And if you're in network, they're going to still pay a portion. It's going to be larger, but it's still going to just be a portion. And there are probably more what they call balance bills, which means after the insurance has paid everything it's going to pay, they send you the bill for the balance that's remaining. There's probably more catastrophic balance billing for Metaflight trips than anything else. And so even with all this other stuff, if you end up with a $40,000 out of a $60,000 helicopter flight that you get a bill for, the fact that you had good health insurance and you had disability insurance and you had saved up as good as you could to pay the things you knew you would have to, that could still blow that plan completely out of the water. And so there's another place for going back to the employer. There may be some really good options to protect against that. But the most cost-effective option for that is as someone who works somewhere. And so it's a group plan for that. And then we'll talk about some common mistakes that we need to avoid, or at least be aware of. Mainly it is buying something that looks like it will provide catastrophic coverage and dropping your catastrophic coverage and then finding out that it doesn't cover those catastrophic expenses. That's the biggest one. So that's what we'll do that night. And then if you say, well, just in regards to what we talked about tonight, you know, what can we do at Ag Defense to be helpful? We're available to visit with you about your current plan through your employer. And if they offer different options, we can help you choose the best plan that your employer is offering you for the things you're most concerned about. We can help you explore the options on your catastrophic coverage if you purchase your own, and show you pros and cons of different approaches and make sure that you get the best price on that. We can visit with your employer about targeted benefits that would address some things that you're still exposed to, even though you've got good catastrophic coverage. And most employers are more than happy to help their employees with those kind of things, especially if they've already got a payroll deduction system set up where they can take it out of, you can take it out of your payroll. They don't mind usually adding those, but they only want to add things that their employees want. And they're more likely to add things that they don't have to pay for, but sometimes they'll even pay for them if they're a good enough value. So we can talk to your employer about those things. If you get an explanation of benefits from your insurance company or a balance bill and you're confused and you don't understand, you know, why am I getting this? I've tried to call, you know, come by, tell us what you're up against, let us make a copy of what you're dealing with, and we'll try to help you get to the bottom of it. So we're there to just kind of be a helping hand when necessary. And then after all is said and done, if there's still some things that you're really concerned about, you know, I guess I would use my own situation, and it was kind of a weak moment for me, but it ended up being a good decision, even though it was an accident. My wife's sister had been diagnosed with cancer, and it was a pretty tough event for them. And I happened to be in the middle of that when the Aflac lady came by where I worked, and I bought a cancer plan mainly because, you know, of what was going on. So it was an emotional purchase. But it was a year and a little bit after that, I was diagnosed with cancer. Well, that might be, you may have cancer that runs rampant in your family, and that might be something you're extremely concerned about, or you may come from a family with a tremendous history of heart disease. So there are some specific policies that provide extra protection for certain types of things that may very well be something that gives you great peace of mind. You know, I don't go out and wholesale, you know, recommend those just to have them, but that ended up being very helpful with our out-of-pocket expenses. So it was a great thing for me, but that doesn't mean everybody should own a cancer plan. And it doesn't mean that everybody who have, you know, relatives who have died of a heart attack should have a critical illness plan. But those things may be something that you as an individual would have a specific concern with, and so we could also visit with you about that.